20th century, Buddhism was already hundreds of years old, and yet the whole of the Western world had hardly become acquainted with it. But this was not to last long, however. A new thinker was arriving, one that would bring Buddhism to the West in a form it would not only understand but also embrace. That man was Alan Watts. Alan Watts was born into middle-class England in 1915. His father earned a modest living as a representative for the Michelin Tire Corporation, while his mother was a housewife. The family's lack of income caused them to reside in a quiet wooded landscape on the edge of town rather than in the city, where land was much more expensive. In addition, his grandfather was a missionary in the Orient, and various missionaries often stayed within the home, telling young Alan stories and fairy tales they learned in their travels. All these factors served to set an ideal reception within Watts to the ideas of Buddhism. The pastoral and natural surroundings of his country home grew within Watts a certain comprehension of the world outside of himself and his family long before others his age. Meanwhile, his mother made sure to instill devout Anglican values in Watts in his youth, granting him a sense of the supernatural and religious aspects of the world. These two factors mixed with all the usual fairy tales and stories he heard as a child, creating within Watts a sense of Orientalism while romanticizing the mysterious qualities of the Far East. Even when he was young, Watts always possessed a certain sense of mysticism. Later in life, he wrote of becoming very ill with a fever while still a child, and experienced a mystical vision, ensuring his intrigue with the supernatural for the rest of his life. He claimed to have another spiritual experience while walking with his wife some 30 years later. The various gifts his mother received from missionary friends were often on display about the home and fascinated him as well. He once wrote of these pieces, "I was aesthetically fascinated with a certain clarity, transparency, and spaciousness in Chinese and Japanese art. It seemed to float." These events all seemed to create a certain correlation within Watts' mind between man and nature and their respective relationship. As Alan matured, he spent large amounts of time in various boarding schools. As a teen, he became friends with a wealthy man named Francis Croshaw, who held very strong Epicurean beliefs. In short, materialism. Croshaw took a teenage Alan under his wing and gave him access to his ample library. It was in the collection of Francis Croshaw that Alan was first exposed to Buddhist writings, and he came to find them fascinating. However, all of this new rush of knowledge was confusing to Alan. He knew that these Buddhist ideas could not happily coexist with the tenets of the devout Anglican upbringing bestowed on him by his mother. It was clear that he would have to choose between the two. The choice he made was for Buddhism, and he committed himself wholly to the movement. His first action as a Buddhist was to join the London Buddhist Lodge, and before long had become their secretary, the youngest ever at the age of 16. He immediately began writing his first essays and experimenting with meditation that laid the groundwork for his later revelations. All of these events were simply the beginning of the powerful and important work that Watts would execute for the rest of his life. It was Watts' earnest opinion that the greatest problem with Western civilization was its tendency to exclude the individual. He believed that a good portion of society was consciously devoted to create a feeling in the average man of being alone, separate, and rejected by the whole, regardless of what they might attempt to do for themselves. This portion of society, he believed, was most assuredly at the root of civilization, and centered in the Western world's reliance on, and center in, Judeo-Christian religious culture. These tenets and stories created a depiction of God as a superior father figure, while man was simply a lowly, disobedient, and unruly child. It created a mindset within its followers of a reject, a castaway from God's favor and paradise, banished to suffer in the material world forever. Because of this mindset, man had no choice but to consider itself a freak, born to the world but never part of it. Watts once commented on this sensation like this: "The most strongly enforced of all known taboos is the taboo against knowing who or what you really are behind the mask of your apparently separate, independent, and isolated ego." But how does one escape this mindset? Watts stated that the only solution man could be expected to arrive at naturally and instinctively was to become superior to the world. That is, man must become greater than the world by either proving himself superior to it or evolving beyond need for it. Man makes himself superior to the world through controlling it with classification and patterning. Man tries to make sense of a senseless land. Watts declared that the wild nature of the world was a frightening aspect and idea to man. Man tried to quell this fear by cultivating nature with seeds of culture, while capturing nature and removing its unpredictability through science. However, this was all a terrible mistake, in Watts' opinion, because in removing the world's natural essence, man had thrown the world off balance. It was an abuse of the world we live in by using it solely for man's needs without regarding the world's needs. Because of this, man does not find himself master of a strange land, but even more removed from it, making the whole of existence fall under the influence of man's feelings of separation. This horrible mistake on mankind's part creates a vacuum of contentedness. With everything based upon the material world, and yet everything in the material world separate and uncontrollable, man can find no solace in anything within the world, be it family, religion, or nationality. As man passes down its mastery of the alien world to future generations, it creates a separation between family or even authority. How can we trust those who taught us that everything in the world is hostile and bloodthirsty? As a result, the only person or thing anyone may come to rely in is themselves, and thereby completely undermining any allegiances any individuals may have, because ultimately everyone is only looking out for themselves. Therefore, any unity or appearance of unity in mankind is simply temporary and or false. Man can no longer trust anyone and is soon bound to destroy itself and the whole of the world as well through its own fear and paranoia. But what causes us to feel this way? Society tricks us into believing we are separate. It is entirely the fault of the influence of authority and parentage. Children do not feel disconnected, that is, until their parents begin to bestow their own heirloom of these thoughts and feelings of detachment. They impart this knowledge subconsciously and early on in the child's life in order to vicariously achieve some sort of second chance through their child for their own missed opportunities and failures. They begin to impact stereotypical encouragement on the child, telling them that they only get one chance at life and therefore they must achieve as much as they are physically capable of. Through these achievements, they teach their children that they will gain meaning and value, while without them they will be worthless as human beings. Ultimately, Watts refers to this stigma of individuality as permanent brain damage. That is, a constantly repeating lie in the minds of these poor little children, keeping them from realizing their potential as a god. Watts spoke of this in an almost tragic and ironic way, saying, "How is it possible that a being with such sensitive jewels as the eyes, such enchanted musical instruments as the ears, and such fabulous arabesque of nerves as the brain, can experience itself anything less than a god?" Now, having identified this problem with the human mindset, Watts naturally seeks a solution. The solution, he said, was within man all along. Man must revert to its natural state, which is sharing its center with everything around it. To reinforce this argument, Watts takes a scientific approach by citing the human body's correlation with its environment. He argues that the two fit together like pieces of a puzzle. For example, oxygen suiting the lungs, fruit and meat suiting the digestive system, and so forth. He concludes that ultimately the environment which man resides in is just as essential to his existence as the organs and other things which reside within him. He said, "I find that the sensation of myself as an ego inside a bag of skin